The next recorded talk is 50 minutes long by Shagor Rahman, Humanity's Story, A Search for Moral Clarity.
Hi, everybody. So I'll be going over what I'm calling Humanity's Story, A Search for Moral Clarity. And I'll get into kind of what that cheeky title means, going over kind of myth, morality, narrative, self-understanding, and the meaning of life. And no, that one was too far, but I guess not too much farther than what I'm claiming. Before we get started, I just want to give a big thank you to the Inference Institute, for overall the work they do. It's been super rewarding and engaging to be a part of. I put my information here, so feel free to reach out if anything piques your interest or bothers you, or you have to correct anything. Feel free to give me a shout. So we'll be discussing a few things, as I mentioned. So one of the big roles that I feel active inference can one of the ways that it can at least intuitively scale into human culture, first of all, is through our use of symbols. Kind of what makes us unique as a species can be understood semiotically or through symbols. And the road there, as I make the case in Myth of Objectivity, is through morality, largely by codifying norms and expectations, which again ties very nicely into active inference, I believe. The last way is through narrative. And specifically, I'll be talking about kind of at a meta level, the narrative of modern narrative. And why are we doing this? It's epistemic reasons, interesting as it is. But also, I think that kind of applying a rigorous framework to humanity specifically, particularly as we get into narrative, we'll see it more broadly tackle some other areas of humanity. And this is necessary, I feel, for cultural cohesion, something generally lacking these days, with partisan and polarizing the nature of our culture at the moment and our politics. And so it'll achieve, hopefully, or at least understand the outlines for cultural cohesion and things like social and personal integration. And I'll do this by, as I mentioned, by expanding upon my myth of objectivity hypothesis. Right? And so my own road to becoming interested in the free energy principle and active inference was being disillusioned with the economics paradigm, finding it to be, as I'm sure other folks were, insufficient to describing human behavior, even through the kind of quote-unquote narrow lens of the marketplace. Conceiving people as the neoclassical framework does as utility maximizing individual agents who are well versed in what their own preferences and interests are, is kind of quite unrealistic, to say the least. Not only that, but behavioral economics didn't really do it for me either. It also held up this idea, this neoclassical idea of rationality, as the kind of gold standard. And you can see that with some of the recommendations, the way we should, constantly default to 401ks. Maybe that makes sense, but it comes up with that advice, it justifies that advice using this kind of principle of stationarity, meaning an agent's preferences should not change over their lifetime, which of course is not realistic. And so kind of speaking of behavioral paradigms that are lacking, at first I thought, well, the neoclassical model on its own isn't interesting. Maybe we can marry that with some views of moral philosophy, because I'm sure moral philosophers have a much better view of humanity. Well, that's what I thought. So here are a few different moral philosophies that maybe some of you folks are aware of, maybe others not. But kind of briefly, deontology, utilitarianism are traditional from the Enlightenment era, going back to Kant and Stuart Mill, paradigms of moral philosophy. Interpretivism is a bit more recent, but I think it's still been around for quite some time. And the last one is just a couple examples of some Eastern philosophy. And so when we think about, I guess the question I'll pose to those listening is, what type of thermodynamic systems, in terms of their adaptability, how do we characterize these various different systems? Are they single equilibria? Are they steady states? Um, are they maybe chaotic? Maybe they don't reach any equilibria. How do we think about these? So firstly, deontology and utilitarianism. And if you're not familiar with them, don't worry about it. I'll kind of explain it. But deontology and utilitarianism, I view as single equilibrium, even though they are different. They seem to have one kind of one unifying mistake, which is the environment or kind of context doesn't change, or in other words, there is no uncertainty in these systems that they assume by their prescriptions of morality and moral philosophy. So deontology assumes that there are a certain set of rules that you should never violate, that never change over time. So maybe thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal, etc., etc. There's no conditions under which those should be violated. Um, and utilitarianism, this is all of your actions are based, their morality at least is evaluated based upon the impact that they'll have on the aggregate welfare of others. Right. So this is kind of featured, for instance, in The Good Place for those watched it. But the problem with both of these is that, in a word, it's uncertainty. Right? There's no epistemic foraging. There's no model for how agents come to learn. Okay, what are the rules? Maybe the deontic rules that I should follow. What are the ways that my actions impact others? Like, what is that process of socialization, that kind of awareness, those, the empathy, all the things that, should I read a book? Should I read fiction? How should I speak to people? All these are essentially epistemic tasks, kind of learning tasks that are not featured into these twin systems. And I'll get into perhaps what this reveals about Western society. Kind of spoiler, but this is the kind of analytical bias of Western society, I think, revealing itself in deontology and utilitarianism specifically. So interpretivism, this comes out of postmodernism, I believe, or at least it was re-brought into the dialogue following modernism into postmodernism, Jacques Derrida, etc. So it says essentially kind of rejecting these analytical reduction, single equilibrium, as I've presented it here, frames of moral philosophy, and says that, well, it's based on the agent's interpretation of their behavior. What are the context for their actions? Also, how do they interpret their actions, et cetera, et cetera. Well, of course, it's an important element of morality. The kind of classification that at least I would label is chaotic, right? So if we're just saying it's up to someone's interpretation, well, how should they interpret it? Should everyone interpret it differently? Is everyone's interpretations equally accurate? How should we, yada, yada, yada. And the point is that it's not super helpful for society to, as a approach to morality. All right, so final two, Confucianism and Taoism. I see them as being adaptive and being steady state, focused on the kind of rituals and behaviors, not content specifically, not focused on particular deontics, and not kind of hyper focused on the impacts of behaviors to others. Although that can be a component, as can interpretation, but it's really about the emphasis of these two paradigms, kind of an inherently acknowledging that the world is changing, that society is changing, and yet the goal of morality at both the personal and social level is to find coherence. So it's kind of still privileging some kind of equilibria, some kind of harmony, but not kind of how you get there. And I'll get into how it does that. with active inference. So, before active inference, what I would say is that of Taoism and Confucianism, they come from a tradition that Carl Jung would label as the mythological construct of the cosmic human or cosmic man, aka the symbolic self, which is the term I'll use for kind of going forward, because it kind of ties into my theme of symbolic agents, etc. So the point is that Carl Jung, after surveying, doing a cross-cultural analysis of various different mythologies and traditions, found that this particular, what he called archetype, reemerged. And essentially, the cosmic human was the perspective that we are all kind of connected to one another, not only to other people, but to the cosmos and to the world in general. And our actions do have consequences because of that inherent interconnections. Moreover, we do have a certain responsibility to the world as a whole, to other people, because of our place as a kind of a node in this hierarchy. This is I'm signaling where I'm going with this, but it allows, as you can see, an area both for the kind of characteristic states, so the ways to minimize uncertainty, kind of using both that epistemic and exploitative paradigm of active inference. But it kind of does so specifically by conceiving this kind of broad view of the self, right? And so here, of course, is how it connects to active inference. So active inference, unlike the neoclassical framework and unlike other single equilibrium approaches to social science and to science in general, it allows nodes to communicate both with spatially and temporally. And so kind of over time, an individual passes information to itself, or to kind of quote unquote its future self, and in some ways it's its past self in terms of goals. But the self is not a stationary construct. It is something that is constantly seeking what other nodes are kind of included in my hierarchy, what other selves are included in kind of myself, and the symbolic self is an example of our ability to explicate all these different nested nodes. So the result of us being a symbolic agent is that every time we meet someone, say, who says they're Canadian, well, if we haven't met this person before, our model of what it means to be Canadian now includes that person. We now have a instance of the general concept of a Canadian, of that kind of general archetype. So that means that the model we have of Canadian, whether or not we are Canadian, we have the ability to constantly compute what the self is, and by virtue, what the other is. And so the kind of road, the trajectory that I outline that kind of brought us to here, and what it means and all that, I draw from our social bias. So what are kind of some instinctual impulsive elements that first started to see human society expand kind of outward laterally, or even over time? Well, at least laterally, at least kind of within a specific time. I make the case that it's social bias, something that we are inherently born with. Although we are not, born racist per se, we are born with a specific bias, and that's accent bias or shibboleth. It does seem to be something that emerges in utero, and we have preference for pronunciations, for vocal accents, over others, those we are more familiar with. And while that's often negative, it does have clear biological benefits. Of course, that's why it exists, and that's why it persists today. And secondly, what do we do with a society that's based on people with the same accents? Well, that's an inherently unstable one that's not super adaptive, although is extensive and allows for greater cooperation. It's unstable because it allows for deviance, free riding, things like that. Okay, so enter morality, enter morals. And so here now we're connected in this symbolic node way by codifying those expectations, by minimizing surprise, using morality. Right. So this is my kind of myth of objectivity. You're supposed to behave cooperatively. You're supposed to follow these norms by virtue of where you've grown up. That is social bias. That is shibboleth. Evidently, you are not doing that. So how do I deal with that surprise? Well, over time, of course, that model you have, the shared model you have of that's based on identifying with those like you, starts to wear thin, starts to break down. And so in comes morality as a way to stabilize, to offer kind of a hood that you place on deviance, and that you can then use to shame and guilt into aligning with the shared model. Or of course, there's punishment, and ostracization, and other things, right? But that's what the tool that morality probably had in the Pleistocene and continues to have with us today. All right. Okay. That third leg is okay. So if this is the self, what are we modeling off of? Right. So we have the internal model, active inference. We have the Markov blanket that screen between us and the world. So then we have the external states. So what, once we have kind of symbolized the self, what is the world? What exactly are we modeling off of? Sometimes it's the world. You can say, okay, well, think about farming. Think about someone who's born and raised as a farmer. The land will feature very prominently in their model of the world. Think about a hunter. The land will figure, the world itself, the physical world will mean something. However, it won't mean everything. So, what are some other things that will constitute the world? Probably the other. Right. So, social bias, of course, works into that. There's those who sound like you. There's those who's not, or those not like you. So, by virtue of having a bias means that you're biased away from other people, and that's why we don't like to admit that we have biases. And that's why we were troubled when people tell us that we're biased. So that's one example. Or the trouble with the other, and you can think about the Cold War. Think about any time that a country is under attack, the other becomes prominent, becomes salient. The in-group binds together, and for a while, whether it's 9/11 or whether it's during World War II, there's kind of great social cohesion. Trouble of war's end, enemies become salient, and then what happens? Well, this is how we have this is enter kind of mythology. Not that these things are entirely separable. There's a lot of overlap, but for our purposes, if we think of mythology and we start to think of narrative, what we're talking about is in the language of Michael Levin and Chris Fields, we're explicating the reference frame. We're explicating the measure, the kind of yardstick of what's good, what's bad. Whereas, according to Michael Levin, the frame of reference that allows agents, whether bacteria or complex organisms, to judge whether they should approach something, whether they should avoid it, is an internalized coordinate plane or frame of reference. What we're doing eventually, once we get to myth, once we get to explicit morality, once we get to narrative, is we're explicating that frame of reference. We're saying, okay, these group of people say are evil. We're all descended from this ancestor, from Hercules, from Beowulf, from this kind of half man, half god. We're explicating these reference frames to gain cultural solidarity, to gain cultural cohesion, right? And so I mentioned this. This is kind of more going into my myth of objectivity hypothesis, but I'll just kind of briefly show it because I would love to get some feedback from the folks listening to this. So this is how I have I hope to formalize, how we, um, you know, became symbolically literate, if you will. So that kind of path from shibboleth to morals, to full symbolic agent. And so I just have kind of an agent here, assuming that another agent B has a fellow accent, therefore shares the model of the world, has some error. The error reaches some threshold, and then suddenly, if then else, you end up um, with a new model that eventually leads you to um, modeling the prediction error. So here I have a somewhat familiar equation, but kind of modified. But instead of um, taking the where the posterior is kind of conditional on um, traditionally conditional on the model, here in place of that I have an objectified error. So the point is that you have these categories of, whereas typically the prediction error will just be whatever kind of noise that you experience that are not in line with the prediction, and either you'll select a different prediction model, a different model at that point, um, or you just assume it away as noise. In this case, there is an explicit model of error. So when someone decides to steal food, when someone decides to not help with child rearing, when someone decides, I can't think of any moral deviations. But the point is that there is a specific set of deviations from the typical predictions versus just being surprised generically. So it's a modeled version of error that then allows an agent A to view a given agent um, as possessing the ability to select between adherence to a higher level or superordinate model, now an objective model um, of the group, or a narrow one, so they can comply or they can deviate. That's a C and D subscript. And the point is that, or I guess one takeaway is that, okay, this is metacognition, that kind of upper level superordinate G, um, and this is transjective, meaning that it's not purely objective. It's framed as objective from the point of view of the agent, but that only means that they're transcending their own subjectivity and the subjectivity of the agent by conceiving that they have the ability to select between a higher level or a lower level model. And so, in this kind of simple way, at least at this level of explanation, we can see how, from an active inference point of view, we could have gotten to something like objective morality, and more importantly, something like free will. And of course, the various different significance. And so, just again, a couple. I view this as the kind of a hypothesis hiding in plain sight. Why? Because morality is something that we're so impulsive about, something we have so many emotional ties to. For instance, we're constantly looking for we're constantly claiming to be the victim. We're constantly looking for people who victimize, and yet we can't really agree on what the specific contents of morality should be. Even though, when I mentioned deontology, I'm sure there was folks listening who had ideas of what could be deontic, meaning forever there. So I went over some of this. There's social biasing, morality. There's an impulse to do this, and there's some kind of research that I've done. In the economics, going back to that neoclassical paradigm, although I was kind of dumping on it earlier, what these single equilibrium analyses allow for is the ability to say, okay, well, where does this model break down? Where does this model fall? So you might say it falls down everywhere. Well, it's not quite true. People are selfish. They do have stationary preferences, at least for a long enough time for that model to be useful. However, it does fall down in certain interesting ways. One interesting failure of the single equilibrium economics paradigm is the need for social trust. And so social trust means that we have certain expectations. We have expectations that a company selling something sells what they promise to sell. It means that you can, trust the market system, trust the institutions in the market that you inhabit, and engage in economic activity. So you think about this at all levels, you essentially need it. You essentially need to take medicine and understand that, hope that the people are, so ethically inclined, because of course, if they do something bad, they might not get caught for it, yada yada. The point is that there needs to be some sort of agreement on social trust. So it's an example of how kind of morality seeps its way into something, um, even as intended to surgically remove all kind of humanity from the paradigm, all morality, all essence of morality from the study of economics. Social trust and morality seeps back into it. The same thing with linguistics. Won't get into this one too much now, but the idea of transcendental signified. So it's a way of structuring an otherwise kind of elusive set of symbols, linguistic systems. We always have something. There's always, as I mentioned, there's always God. There's always some sort of myth that's tying everything together. Even in secular society, we have not, we don't have kind of uppercase God, G God, the way you might have in the past. There's a lot of different religions, there's a lot of institutions, and probably agnosticism and secularism is kind of increasingly dominant. So what do we have in this case? Well, we have democracy, we have science, we have kind of other essentially kind of mantras, if you will, that require this kind of shared belief element, which kind of has very moral characteristics, but is kind of tied back into a kind of shared belief system that then tethers our norms and expectations to, and allows for us to kind of have social and political dialogue. Um, you know, yeah. Um, so I spent a bit of time on the myth of objectivity hypothesis. Um, quickly, I don't know if I'll have time for this entire run through, but once we have established that we achieved a symbolic capacity, of what is the next step? Do we just kind of walk around shouting symbols? No, we have kind of narratives that attach to our symbols. It's the way we kind of piece them together. It's how we connect one symbol to another at a very kind of crude way of describing this. There's a recent paper on narrative theory and active inference, which I encourage folks to go out there and seek. It covers episodic memory, it covers narrative identity, narrative, so some interesting topics throughout on narrative. The one thing that I wanted to add is it makes the claim that narrative is for the future, it's for prediction, just as many things in active inference are. However, I think that you could equally say that in order to establish, a productive prediction, we write narratives about our past. So we can separate, the person who we were in high school, the person we were, in our 20s, our 30s. So we tell stories about that, about our last job, in order to draw a boundary between us and that person. So it's a way of kind of inheriting inhabiting various selves, but not identifying, not over-identifying with the past one. So I just want to add that because I don't think it was covered in the in that paper. And so here I have a couple different of the core elements of narrative and why I think that it thinks so well in the narrative paradigm. So I think the story describes a set of the underlying events. So it's not explicitly what's in the narrative. So if we read a novel, um, and the novel's a short story about Harry Potter, it's uh, exactly what's happening in that version of Harry Potter. Maybe he's already at school, doesn't kind of go into his backstory necessarily. Um, but the story is all the things, all the underlying events that happen that are related, that are necessarily depicted in that narrative. Um, and so this is essentially the generative process, right? So it's the outside world um, that's being modeled in the narrative and in the kind of causal chain that is the plot. So the point is that I don't know, kind of quickly, but the point is that when discussing or when kind of analyzing um, analytically the core elements of narrative, a lot of the themes that emerge are kind of similar to at least some of the key elements of active inference. Yeah, yeah. Let's skip this one for now. Yeah. So one thing I think it's important to notice is that there is implicit versus kind of explicit um, narratives, um, and so there's the idea of feature placing. So this is essentially how um, vocalizations emerge prior to symbolic use. So other animals have verbal expressions, but they're non-symbolic. A feature placement is kind of one single verbalization um, that might be some way that we can think about how language began. And so essentially, the kind of going back, okay, concepts need context. If we just shout fire, what does this mean? Does it mean that I'm fired from a job? Does it mean that something is burning? Or does it mean that I'm just someone said something was really cool and I'm just saying fire in that kind of slang context? Um, so explaining the explicit. So here, I just wanted to raise the instance of where creating narratives, although everything can be narrated, not everything is narrated. Um, so there could be unconscious events that happen in your past or childhood, or even during the day that you hadn't really thought about. So various different therapeutic techniques address that. So internal family systems is one where you address different emotional states or different psychological states and try to personify those and try to kind of give them uh, abstract structure in your mind by engaging with them through journaling or through dialogue with a therapist. So that's internal family systems. There's also expressive writing similarly. And so if we think about one of the impacts that narrative can have, that's one. And so sometimes it's good to not, sometimes it's good or sometimes it's just fact that we don't have narratives, like we don't have narratives on all of our feelings every day. I don't think we would be able to kind of narrate everything that's happening to us. If we think about meditation and mantras, the idea there is that for a time at least, we shouldn't narrate everything, or at least we shouldn't accept the first kind of order narration, which we think about mindfulness meditation and kind of focusing on the breath as opposed to following our thoughts. Um, for anyone who's practiced meditation, you'll know that um, sometimes we should just be quiet and not listen to the narratives that show up in our brain. We have a couple different obviously examples. Um, right, so here what I'm talking about is, and as I mentioned on the previous slide, or I had it written down, I don't know if I spoke to it, but what we're talking about here is the problem of and promise of cultural narratives. This is most known as master narrative or grand narratives that traditionally would have been the purview of mythology and religion. In more modern times, is kind of constructed in other ways. And so, as I mentioned, from our nomadic multi-band past to even agrarian societies, and then kind of coming into the universal age, these started from these fully integrated narratives where a particular nomadic hunter-gatherer tribe would have a single kind of master cultural narrative, or at least that's what we understand. And so our kind of best guess is that this was the case or wasn't. Which religion am I part of? I'm part of my tribe's religion. Um, why did we catch food today and not yesterday? There was an answer from the shaman for that. This it was fully integrated. Um, the second kind of epoch was the leading up to kind of the axial age, when the universalizing religion, the setting the stage for Christianity, Hinduism, Taoism that I mentioned. So for a very long time, this is kind of following from 10,000 years ago when we started farming. Perhaps up until recently, we had these dominant religions that essentially kind of took over the cultural sphere. Those are the universal narratives, religious narratives that I'm sure folks are aware of. And most recently in um, weird societies or Western societies, is kind of Western educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. Um, that's the acronym for weird there. In my case here is that these are, we're largely in a culturally fragmented environment. So earlier when I mentioned single equilibrium analysis, neoclassical economics, but specifically deontology and utilitarianism, those are all examples of, from I think a thermodynamic systems point of view, from an active inference point of view, this would be kind of a very single equilibrium, kind of ways of looking at the world. And why are they? Well, according to Joseph Enrique, and I think according to some similar analysis from Ian McGilchrist, this is because Western people are distinctly individualistic. They're a bit more left brain centered than at least the axial age portion of society. So those traditionally kind of settled societies that are more gestalt and more right brain oriented would think of things a bit more holistically rather than as kind of reductive. So the good, of course, there's many benefits for left brain thinking. It's more individual, it's more analytical, and it'll be a bit more geared towards science versus more mythology versus stories and narrative. But what is it missing? Well, it can make a lot of mistakes, and not kind of random mistakes, a specific type of mistake, which is leads to kind of reductionism, um, and which is how we kind of ended up with, which might be according to these views, how we kind of ended up with some of the paradigms that we did. Yeah. And so the fragmentation we can understand along kind of these three different dimensions, right? And so one is aesthetic, the next is kind of institutional, and the last is kind of objective. And so this is essentially how I see our master narrative currently broken down. And of course, there could be additional ways, but here's kind of three ways as a starting point to understand the kind of cultural narrative and how specifically it's fragmented. So aesthetic, we have the kind of modern era, the postmodern era, and now what some people are calling the meta modern era. It's maybe a bit too soon to turn on it, However, I do think it's super interesting, especially in the light of the free energy principle, which I'll hopefully have time at the end to kind of touch on. The second one is our institutional narrative. So the economic framework, how we should distribute wealth. Um, what does that say about us, and kind of what's the most quote unquote efficient way? But what are the narratives around our economics? What's our narratives around our politics? And finally, there's this idea of objectivity still kind of creeping in. So, what are the kind of quote unquote true narratives out there? Um, and so, a reasonable question is, okay, this is, we all have kind of our own stories. Perhaps there's still vague senses of a master narrative, and I think there always are. There always kind of might be at least some emergent master narratives by virtue of us kind of all occupying the same, at least digital space, the same kind of time. We'll all converge on some things. However, without a kind of coherent or a more of like a religious story that we perspective that we had in the past, where the narrative is not just okay, we're this third rock from the sun, um, we're revolving around space, and we're victim to laws, and this is what happens to be happening with society. What we lose with the kind of grand cosmic narratives of the past is a type of psychological coherence. So where do we fit into this world? The idea of going back to kind of cosmic band, where is our place in the universe? What is the kind of personal meaning for me? That's where a tighter narrative, kind of more intentional master narrative, comes into play. So our current fragmentation leads to personal anxiety, it can lead to social anxiety, and it can lead to kind of the polarization and partisanship and the results of fragmentation. So institutional misalignment. So whether the company you're working for shares your values, whether they're working on something that is you find deeply meaningful, that is deeply meaningful for your identity and your values. That's what I mean there by misalignment. Okay, so in terms of aesthetics, as I mentioned, the period owner is sometimes called metamodernism, and so that kind of gets into the idea of genres, meaning that we have kind of plenty of good, television, so we have plenty of good narratives available for us to consume. That does include kind of classic genres, but the problem is that they're all genres. So we're all kind of consuming different content. We're all consuming it through different media. Even in times past, not even too far past, we would watch TV at the same time. You would watch the same movies because they're in the movie theater. That's where that's the only place you could watch them up until recently. Now we're watching movies at different times, moving from movies from 20, 30 years back, from 50 years back. And essentially the fragmentation has gone up exponentially. As I mentioned, there's an analytical orientation. And so here, I think it's worth noting that along with the fragmentation that has occurred in weird societies, along kind of side that kind of loneliness that happens with the rise of the analytical world is some great some great literature. And so one of the reasons I argue that this came about was specifically because once mythology, once religion stopped serving the role that it did, that left in particular artists, in particular those kind of aesthetically inclined, to seek out art, to create art in some cases, to fill those gaps for offering a narrative, for answering the questions, the big questions that were typically answered by those institutions. Yeah. And so, kind of going back to my quest, what we're kind of after here is we're looking for greater cultural cohesion. We're aiming for better personal and social integration. So I argue that these pieces are connected. And I'd argue that if the free energy principle has told us one thing, it that agents minimize uncertainty. However, if it tells us another thing, is that one way to verify kind of any claim about a self-organizing system, it's to not look at one paradigm in science. It's to synthesize various different views. So what we can glean from that is essentially a meta-modern approach, which is to not necessarily ensure that everyone in culture, everyone in a particular society is consuming the same content or media, but it's to highlight certain aspects of it that each person can find meaning, and the right type of meaning in their own content. And even if we achieve that through different areas, we'll all be experiencing something similar with each of our traditions that we're interested in. And once we've identified the certain components or make the case for certain components that answer maybe some important questions from an academic point of view, can allow greater visibility into that uncertainty minimizing process at a cultural scale. So here, I think poetry is a great example, and because of its, it reaches everything from the senses, from its sounds to its visuals, to its more deeper symbolic meaning. And I think a great example of that is T.S. Eliot, the great many references he makes in his work, and also the kind of poetic conventions he adheres to, makes it just a kind of very, in some cases, accessible works that he offers. And so, whether it's T.S. Eliot or Kendrick Lamar, in each case, what these artists are constructing is a explicated symbolic self, an explicated number of different nodes in a hierarchy that are connected with all these various references in a particular song. That can be made clear. For instance, in this website, it's Genius, so you can see where the different lines, in this case, Kendrick Lamar has, and what the references were. And so, in a sense, what you experience when we read poetry or we read a work of fiction that has deep references, deep cultural references like this, it's constructing an extensive self, bringing coherence to it and to everyone who listens to it. And by kind of calling it out, you're able to share in it almost as if it's something, it's a greater work of literature in the past, as folks would. And so that, I think, is kind of a few examples of ways we can start to apply a rigorous framework to the humanities to tell us what kind of literature does for us, why it does what it does for us, and parse through some of the components that make it meaningful to us and kind of allow us to use literature in ways that I think it was originally intended to and in past times has. So leave it there, and once again, feel free to reach out to me with my contact information, and please follow my Substack, and let me know if anyone has any feedback. And I just want to thank Daniel Friedman again, and all the folks at the Active Inference Institute and Carl Friston for this content and the discussions here. So thanks again.